Welcome to the Tucson session on healing in altered states. I'm Thomas Brophy from California Institute for Human Science. Very happy to be chairing this session. We have 7 presenters in this session, a little bit more than normal. So we're going to try to keep the talks to 14 minutes for talk plus 2 minutes for question for each presenter. And then we'll be not a lot over the time. And our first presenter is Marjorie Woollcott, presenting on the neurophysiology of the mind-brain question. And I'm going to press the space on this to get this started.
Thank you. It's great to be with all of you today. I'm Marjorie Woollcott, and before I begin, I want to remind you that I have worn 2 hats during much of my research career. As you see on the slide, I'm a member of the Institute of Neuroscience at the University of Oregon. I have performed research and written a textbook for clinicians on neural rehabilitation called Motor Control, translating research into clinical practice. And I've received grants from the National Institutes of Health from $500,000 to $1 million per grant. I've published over 200 papers in neuroscience related originally to brain development, aging, and neurologic disease, but now including research on consciousness, meditation, and mystical experiences. And I've also written a book called Infinite Awareness, The Awakening of a Scientific Mind, as you see on the slide. So I bring an interest in both areas to my continued exploration of consciousness. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about the neurophysiology of the mind-brain question, how brain filters reduce our conscious experience of reality. My proposal is that there are filters within the brain that obscure a wider, more expanded awareness of the universe around us, and they are a critical aspect of daily life. And I will give evidence from my own and other labs that a variety of mystical experiences are associated with either a reduction or an absence of brain activity within these filtering networks. Here is what we will explore. We will be asking questions about what is the normal physiology of the mind-brain and what happens to the brain during mystical experiences. As you see on the slide in the upper left, we'll be looking at brain filters concealing an expanded awareness. Then, as you see on the right, we'll move to meditation research on reducing these filters. Then we'll look at psilocybin research, near-death experience research, neurophysiological models that might explain the data, and we'll end with the significance of the studies. Interestingly, William James, the father of modern psychology, was one of the first researchers to propose that the brain functions as a filter to a vaster awareness. And since then, research in neuroscience suggests that these attentional filters occur at all levels of the brain. What are the filters? Some of them include the sensory receptors themselves that canalize the vibratory information that exists all around us. One example is the pigments in the visual receptors, which only pick up 3 ranges of wavelengths out of the whole vibratory spectrum: blue, green, and yellow. The same is true for all of the senses. The positive aspect of sensory filters is they screen out overwhelming amounts of environmental information so that only information relevant to survival gets through. But there is a cost of filters. You lose awareness of a wider reality. Our first central filter, as you see on the slide, is the default mode network of the brain. Research shows that our normal waking state is highly influenced by this mind-wandering or default mode network, which creates the narrative or the stories we tell about ourselves. And it's considered by many to be the source of the ego, that is, identification with our thoughts, our emotions, and the roles we play. The slide is a brain scan showing 2 nodes of the default mode network, the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex, during our normal background thought processes. They're lit up in bright red, showing their high levels of activity. Research suggests that the more active the default mode network, the less we perceive of the sensory events of the world, as we are lost in our internal stories. Now, another important set of filters is the brain's left hemisphere networks that, as you see on the slide, involve logic, analysis, sequencing, linear thinking, and language. This is compared to the more holistic perceptions of the right brain, which include creativity, imagination, and holistic thinking. In our mechanistic age, the left brain is dominant, and thus more holistic perceptions of reality are diminished. The last filters on our list are the thalamus and the thalamocortical loop. As you see on the left-hand side, the thalamus in white and brown is a major relay center in the midbrain. You can see it right here. Our executive system in the prefrontal cortex, labeled PFC, would get overwhelmed with information if the thalamus passed along all the sensory inputs. But as you see on the right, when it's important to pay attention to one sense, like what is being heard versus what's being seen, the PFC instructs the basal ganglia to activate the thalamic reticular nucleus to inhibit the visual part of the thalamus. This suppresses the flow of visual information and leaves the auditory signal more prominent. Another way that the thalamus takes the filtering even further is through reverberating thalamocortical internal circuitry that competes with sensory inputs for our attentional focus and can dominate all our perceptions with previous memories and our verbal stories. You may notice this sometimes in your day when you're lost in an internal story and notice nothing around you. What methods do we have to modify the filters? Meditation is one approach that is known to modify our neural filters within the brain. So what happens in the brain when you're meditating? Let's first look at a case study that explores perceptual changes during a meditation practice. Roger Walsh, a professor of psychiatry, writes a journal article saying, after deep meditation, the experience feels like having a faint but discernible veil removed from my eyes, and that the veil is made up of hundreds of subtle thoughts and feelings. Each one of these thoughts and feelings seems to act as a competing stimulus or noise that thus reduces sensitivity to any one object. Thus, after meditation, any specific stimulus appears stronger and clearer, presumably because that signal-to-noise ratio is increased. This portrayal of post-meditation perception as removing a discernible veil consisting of layers of mental and emotional activity that compete for one's attention is a compelling metaphor for reduction in the function of the DMN. I will now show research data indicating that this wide-ranging default mode networks activity is significantly reduced in meditation as you increase the strength and the duration of your focus on the breath. This is a study by Judson Brewer and his colleagues from Yale University. It shows significant reductions in those two primary nodes of the default mode network during mystical states of meditation. In the study, they made brain imaging scans of activity in this network in advanced meditators versus novices as they meditated. As you see in the slide, they found that the main nodes of the network are relatively deactivated in meditators compared to novices. The blue areas are the areas whose activity was diminished in meditation. And the graph below shows the significant reduction of this activity in meditators versus novice controls. As you see, the meditators show a drop in activity, whereas the controls do not, in both the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex. I propose that this stilling of our narrative mind actually allows subtle perceptions to come through our awareness that are normally filtered out. That is, the perceptions that mystical experiences are made of. This is another study that shows that it's not just the default mode network activity that's reduced in meditators, but many other parts of the brain. Garrison and colleagues compared experienced meditators with close to 10,000 hours of meditation with novices. The regions of reduced activity included not only areas of the DMN, but also other areas of the brain, as you see in the upper figure, with blue areas indicating decreased activity compared to the novices. Interestingly, as you see in the lower figure, there was also less connectivity between brain areas, including the inferior frontal gyrus controlling inner speech. So, does psilocybin have similar effects? Let's first look at results from Barrett and Griffiths, who studied cancer patients who had life-transforming experiences after their psilocybin experience. And let me first give you an example of the first-person perspective. This is a mystical experience associated with one of their studies. The person said, "In my mind's eye, I felt myself instinctively taking on the posture of prayer in my head. I bowed to this force. I was humbled and honored to be in this presence. It felt more real than any reality I have experienced. Time and space did not exist there. There was only this feeling of unconditional and undying love." So you see in this individual a sense of unity and interconnectedness with all of life and unconditional love. Now let's look at a study comparing the effects of psilocybin to that of meditation on brain filters. This graph compares mystical states during a psilocybin experience and deep meditation. The top panel shows the main nodes of the default mode network in green and red. The middle panel is from a study by Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris comparing brain scans during placebo conditions and after psilocybin ingestion. Note that the participants experienced decreased brain activity in the DMN as indicated in blue. And the decreased activity was directly related to the intensity of the subjective spiritual effects. The bottom panel shows that these results are similar to the above study on meditators that we just discussed. So meditation and psilocybin are both decreasing activity in the DMN. What's the significance? They show that two different types of experience, each with a different triggering event, but both leading to mystical states of unity awareness, show the same general reduction in DMN activity. So this gives us yet more evidence to support the hypothesis that expanded states of awareness are correlated with reduction of brain activity. Let's continue now to examine studies of near-death experiences. Are perceptual filters also reduced in NDEs? Again, I will begin with the first-person experience of an NDE. This is the NDE of Dr. Bettina Payton, who was an avowed materialist until she had a near-death experience during the birth of her third child by C-section. Payton lost consciousness under anesthesia until she heard a voice. Her blood pressure is too low. Her anesthesiologist's alarmed voice had snapped her awake as if from a deep sleep. In the next instant, she felt a strange stillness. Her heart had stopped. Payton watched the anesthesiologist slam his fist into a large red button in the wall, calling a code that would culminate in the arrival of the hospital resuscitation team. Payton had the feeling that she was about to die. At the same time, her vision opened and she discovered that she could see into the room. How amazing. The eyelids on her physical eyes had been taped shut, yet by some other mechanism, she could see perfectly clearly. She says, "Then I let myself fall in a graceful backward arc into the unknown. Laced within the darkness were particles of shimmering light with an intelligence, a pulsating power. All was perfect until her experience was interrupted by a statement, 'You must live.' Funneling down through the darkness, her consciousness opened into the confines of the hospital operating room. Her surgeon was working in a surgical field filled with blood, performing what he would later call was his first 3-minute hysterectomy. Her attention was then drawn to a white-haired surgeon entering the room. Without a word, he reached into her blood-filled abdomen, located the aorta, and clamped it shut. Shortly after, one of the team whispered into Payton's ear that she had a healthy daughter. When Payton later opened her eyes, she was in the critical care unit, surrounded by the medical team. She still had a tube in her trachea and couldn't speak, but wrote down words to this effect. I know I have a baby girl. I know my uterus is out. I know my heart stopped. After her NDE, once Bettina Payton awoke, she was utterly convinced that consciousness is primary. This first-person experience tells us that when Payton's heart had stopped and her EEG was flatlined, the lack of brain activity was correlated with verified perception of activity by the medical team and expansive mystical experience. Here is one example of a prospective study by Dr. Pim van Lommel showing scientific data of expanded awareness being associated with cardiac arrest and lack of brain activity. The study was published in The Lancet, ranked number 2 of 150 journals in medicine. They included 344 patients who had cardiac arrest and survived. 12% had a core NDE, and a quarter of those watched and recalled events during cardiac arrest with no brain activity. Van Lommel concludes in the article, the thus far assumed but never proven concept that consciousness and memories are localized in the brain should be discussed. How could a clear consciousness outside one's body be experienced at the moment that the brain no longer functions during a period of clinical death with flat EEG? I want to remind you that we don't have brain scan data on NDEs because we can't put someone in a brain scanner during cardiac arrest. But we know the default mode network and other filters are deactivated because the entire brain is deactivated. And in this slide, you have evidence from Pim van Lommel of what happens to the brain activity during an NDE. This is from a cardiac arrest patient who had an NDE. It shows the heartbeat of the patient stopping, and then in the next interval, the EEG becoming flat as well. So what models can explain these data related to meditation, psilocybin, and NDE effects? This model can explain what happens when we go from normal waking consciousness to an experience of expanded consciousness in one of these experiences. In normal waking awareness, our capacity to experience non-local cosmic consciousness appears to be reduced in the presence of a normal functioning brain. And this is represented by the attentional filters. In fact, here is the default mode network that most scientists agree exists as part of our brain activity. Now, the default mode network creates those narrative stories of our egoic mind, pictured here as one of our brain filters, and you notice the egoic narrative is pictured as very, very large. Now, the previous slides have shown that when brain activity is reduced, either during NDEs, meditation, or neuromodulatory drugs, there is enhanced capacity to experience non-local consciousness. The filter is reduced or removed. This is represented by that reduced mental activity here in the slide of that narrative mind and this large green arrow flowing from our non-local consciousness down toward our mind and brain. So this is our state during mystical experiences or NDEs. So what have we learned about the neural correlates of mystical states of consciousness through examining meditation, NDEs, and psilocybin studies? Research in each area, from both first-person experiences and laboratory studies, has given evidence to support the hypothesis that the activity of brain filters that normally conceal the fundamental nature of consciousness are reduced or absent during these experiences. Experiences of meditative awakening, psilocybin, and NDEs appear to open a doorway to a higher awareness through the stilling of neural filters, including the default mode network that's the basis of our egoic identity. I believe these data offer compelling evidence for the fundamental nature of consciousness. And I want to leave you with an article. In fact, the article that formed part of the basis for this presentation today that I authored with Dr. Anne Shumway-Cook in the Journal of Near-Death Studies in the spring of 2020. Thank you very much.
Is there maybe one quick question? Okay. Oh, yes.
And I can't hear anything.
Can you hear the questioner?
No, I cannot hear the questioner. Can you repeat it?
Okay, sorry. So I'm sorry, my question's not very well articulated, so I'll have to think of it as I espouse it out. So I'm interested in the right and left brain aspects and handedness, your dominant eye, and how if your hand-eye coordinations are confused, because typically I think your dominant eye aligns with your dominant hand, but for some of us it does not. And so I'm wondering if there's been any research or if you have any thoughts about how that crossing of our systems can lead to either interference or confusion or how we cope. Thanks.
Sure. And just briefly to let you know that the left and the right brain phenomena of the left brain going to the right hand, basically limiting our awareness to parts of the world versus a holistic view of the world is certainly critical in this filtering process. And I think there's been a beautiful book by Jill Bolte Taylor talking about how when she had a stroke to that part of the brain, she lost the ability, for example, to speak and to understand a lot of things, but she became much more holistically aware and also empathetic toward the feelings of others. I don't know about disconnects between the left side of the body, for example, and the eyes and the visual system, so I can't answer directly that part of your question, but thank you.
Okay, one more quick question.
Hi, you showed that in the absence of EEG activity in the brain, there were reports of expanded consciousness. So, and then you used the term mind brain. So I'd like you to expand on that.
Well, and when I say mind brain, what I'm meaning is that we definitely have a conscious awareness that is still present. I mean, people that have NDEs. And so definitely, even when the brain is inactive, as we talked about, and the data show that, we still have an ability to be aware, in this case, of those people watching, for example, the recovery of, or the resuscitation team working on their own recovery. So I think by mind brain, I'm meaning that basically the mind is there even when the brain becomes quiet. And yet, obviously, when the brain becomes active again, the person actually has a feeling of like re-entering their body and experiencing pain and all of those other sensations of the body once more.
So I just wonder, where is the mind?
Where is the mind? The mind doesn't have to be in the body. I think that's perhaps a bigger question to discuss. I think it can be very, very broad because it can have this non-local interconnection with other people and things around the world. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much. One very brief question. Very, very brief.
Isn't it a little depressing to think that love, what we've traditionally known as divinity, God, comes by this artificial means of something wrong in the brain rather than, let's say, meditation or one's effort in life, that somehow the same divine effect is just simply a case of manipulation in the brain? Do you feel that there's something strange about that?
Well, I think perhaps I didn't hear your whole question, but you're asking whether perhaps the belief or the experience of something that's divine is perceived by many people in materialist science as being simply an illusion due to hallucinations or something like that in the brain during meditation or during NDEs. And I don't see how that can happen when, at least during NDEs, when the brain is flatlined, people have a perception that is more clear than they have during normal waking state. So it seems that we see the brain has stopped working, and yet people have perceptions of the world around them that are very, very accurate and clear.
Okay, thank you. Okay, our next presenter is also remote, and then all the others are on ground after that. So next is from the Institute of Noetic Sciences, Helane Wahbeh, talking on extended perception corroboration, a pilot study with energy medicine practitioners.
Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, great. It is wonderful to be here with you today, sharing about this topic. I'm going to give you a little bit of background on energy medicine, talk about a pilot study that we did in relation to this, and then talk about our current study methods and results, conclusion, and next steps. And this is really at the intersection of energy medicine and extended perception. And I'll try to weave in why this is relevant to consciousness and specifically non-local consciousness. So what is energy medicine? It is healing modalities that can manipulate or channel purported subtle energies that are associated with the body. And some examples are Reiki, Qigong, Barbara Brennan method, healing touch, and therapeutic touch. And for our study, we specifically are focusing on Reiki. And Reiki means, Rei means spiritual or hidden force, and Ki means life energy. So it is universally guided or spiritual life energy. This modality originated in Japan, and they believe that the therapist can channel this universal life force energy into the patient to activate the natural healing process. So they're not healing the patient directly, they're essentially channeling this universal life force energy to support the patient's natural healing process, and thus can be used for any patient for any condition. So there have been some studies already done on energy medicine and specifically Reiki. It's been instituted in various healthcare settings around the world. There have been a number of systematic reviews done. For example, this one done by Shamini Jain of the Consciousness Healing Initiative found 12 RCTs, 9 of which had positive improvements in pain. Another systematic and meta-analysis of 4 RCTs, this one's found positive results. This one's interesting because 2 of the studies, the practitioner was local, and in 2 of them, they were actually distant. And these are controlled studies, and they saw improvements on pain for visual analog scales. And then finally, in 2019, there was a general review looking at preliminary support for relieving pain, decreased anxiety, depression, and improving quality of life. Obviously, there is more research needed. So adding to the literature is a large study that we conducted a couple years ago of energy medicine for hand and wrist pain. It was an uncontrolled study. The objectives were to look at feasibility and preliminary effects, to look at mechanisms by which the health outcomes improved, and if there were any mechanisms that we could observe between the practitioner and the receiver. The study design, we had a number of measures before a 30-minute energy healing session. We had measures after the 30-minute session, and then 3 weeks later. We had 17 energy medicine practitioners and 193 participants with hand and wrist pain. We had subjective measures, we had physiology, and we also collected measures from the environment, including water samples that were on the practitioner and the participant. We also had random noise generators in the room that collected data consistently. So there were a number of significant findings from this pilot study. We did see a reduction in hand and wrist pain, both post-session and 3 weeks later. We saw changes in the water worn on the practitioner in something called evanescence. We saw differences in the random number generator data compared to control conditions. We saw effects of local and geocosmic on the pain improvements. And then we also saw extended perceiver changes of the extended perceiver that were observing the sessions, which is what we're going to go into more deeply today. You can see all of the papers that came out of this at this website, if you would like. These have all been published in a special issue of Explore. So today we're going to be talking more deeply about this one specific measure that I'm calling extended perception. So many people believe that not only is there a biofield within and around the body, but that some people can perceive its characteristics with intention and also to support healing. So essentially, their consciousness is not limited to their brain. It can access information outside of their traditional five senses and perceive what is happening in someone's body. Traditionally, this has been called clairvoyance. It's also called medical intuition. And for this talk, I'll be calling it extended perception because it goes beyond our traditional five senses. So in that original pilot study that I was just sharing you about, we had one person who was skilled at this sitting in the room for each of those 193 energy medicine sessions, and they took copious notes. We took those notes and did a qualitative analysis on what they saw and found 8 themes. The first was that the participant's hand and wrist pain was actually caused by multiple etiologies, that there was a relationship between the participant and practitioner that was important, that the healing process was unique to the individual and not to the practitioner, that the practitioner affected the energy either on their own or with supposed non-physical beings that were in the space and working with them, that energy existed in the space and between the practitioner and participant, that energy can be manipulated, that it has specific characteristics, and that these characteristics change as the sessions ensue. So these 8 themes translated into 119 binary variables that were the codes of these qualitative data themes. And we did a linear regression to see if any of these perceptions related to the change in pain outcomes. And after multiple comparison corrections, we found 5 codes that did. So if the perceiver mentioned the color yellow, that was more associated with not as much pain improvement, which is fascinating. If they observed the practitioner touching the participant, that had better outcomes. If there were apparent non-physical beings, guides or helpers in the room, that was associated with greater pain outcomes, as it also not just guides or helpers, but these kind of broader supposed beings that were in the room. And this other code of helping, assisting, teaching of non-physical beings was associated with not as much improvement in pain at 3 weeks. So these are all very fascinating findings that we published, this case study. But the major limitation of this work is that there was just one perceiver in the room. So you could say, okay, they're just making all this up. What's the reference point for these perceptions, if you will? Very preliminary work. So we wanted to follow up with this. Were these perceptions really objective perceptions that could be perceived by anyone, that could be corroborated across multiple different perceivers? So this follow-up study also included 30-minute energy medicine sessions. In this case, Reiki masters. They were highly vetted. It also included 14 participants from 4 different health categories. They had either acute injury, depression, anxiety, or memory problems. And similar to the previous study, we had a number of measures before the sessions and also after the sessions. This study was within subject design, so it wasn't controlled, and everybody received an authentic treatment. The Reiki masters had many years of experience and had, thousands of sessions that they had done. They committed to only do Reiki, but they could lightly touch the participant. The perceivers also had many years of experience, over thousands of sessions, and came from a wide variety of backgrounds in terms of their training. They had to be able to externally see. And what we mean by that is they could see colors. They could actually see shifts in the energy with their external sight, if you will. And they committed to being neutral from the session, so not affecting the Reiki session. This is what the room looked like. We had these 3 tables with 2 perceivers at each table, and a rolling chair for the practitioner, and the participant was in front of them. I'm going to skip through this. We had a number of different outcomes. The primary outcome was well-being in the Arizona Integrative Outcome Scale, and we had a variety of subjective outcomes, including sleep quality, positive and negative affect, interconnectedness, credibility, and expectancy, which is important to measure in these type of studies. We also looked at what we called review of systems, symptom checklist, an energy code checklist, and an observation table. And during the sessions, the perceivers drew out what they were seeing, and we videotaped them doing that. So just to give you a sense of what these looked like, that's the review of systems symptom checklist. It goes through kind of standard clinical symptoms. The coded checklist was based on the energy, colors, how it was moving, its quality. This was the drawing form, and this was the observation table that they could fill out after each session. So there are a number of research questions that we looked at. Do the participants perceive any benefit from that main outcome? And if there are any variables that predicted that, do the perceivers empirically see in the same way? What's the corroboration across all the participants of this study? Did the perceivers actually accurately pick up the health state of the participant? And were there any symbols that were noted, and were those meaningful to the participants? So this is, we looked at qualitative and quantitative outcomes. And for the qualitative outcomes, we had this correspondence judging scale that went from 0, no correspondence, up to 7, excellent correspondence. So for the first question about the symptoms, did people actually get benefit from the session? And repeated measures analysis was highly significant, showing that their well-being did improve. This was primarily motivated by the change from baseline to after session and before session to after session. We also saw that negative affect improved, meaning that negative affect decreased. And this was significant after a multiple comparison correction. In terms of predictors for well-being, we did not see any difference based on age, belief, credibility, health outcome, or practitioner. So this is a quite interesting finding. In terms of if the perceivers empirically saw the same way, looking at the different tools, with the observation tables, the score was above a 3, which is what we chose for our threshold for corroboration. And this was for the actual observation, the meaning, and overall. With the coded checklist, which was a quantitative measure, I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to go through all these, but these were the top 10 codes that were listed. And we look at percent agreement, we see that it was 0.70 by code, 0.56 by session, and 0.74 overall. And this corresponds to substantial for 0.70 and 0.74 agreement, according to the Landis measurement of observer agreement for categorical data. This is a picture of 6 of the drawings. You see the rich, incredibly rich data that we collected here. And again, through the qualitative judging, we found that that corresponded to about a 4.7 scale, which was above the 3 that we predicted. We also did video while they were doing this and found that 100% of the taped video sessions had at least one instance when more than 2 perceivers saw a similar element within 2 minutes. And we looked at this by color, by part of the body, and both. This was also an interesting finding. I'm going to skip through this. We also saw high percent agreement between the participants, the Reiki masters, and the perceivers. Many of these were above 0.80. We also saw that the 6 perceivers had high agreement on this review of systems checklist. So they were able to tell what symptoms the person was experiencing, and that their answers matched with each other. And then finally, we had some interesting symbols that were noted by the perceivers that the participants found meaningful. 23 of the 40 sessions, they said there were angels in the room that the participants found meaningful. Some example symbols include lightning, and then the participants said they had a dream about lightning with their sister, and Lucky Charms, totally random, that the perceiver saw and the participant saw that also. So I know I'm going very quickly here. I'm running out of time, but generally Reiki did improve well-being. We need more controlled trials. Perceiving is complex. People experience it in different ways. If we want to look at external seeing, we need to give them more instruction, and we need a nomenclature for how to describe what is seeing perceived. Very, very rich information, and yet without clear, specific instructions, there's a lot of noise in the signal. This study is currently under peer review, but it's available in SciArvix if you want to check it out. Next steps include automated analyses of the text and focusing on the content, pulling out the rich content that we saw in this paper. We're working on a medical intuition study and more studies, controlled studies with Reiki. Go to noetic.org for more information on this. Deep gratitude to the many people who helped make this happen. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Is there a very quick question?
You referred to colors, in one case yellow, and I wasn't sure whether that was an increase or decrease. And you mentioned colors again. Could you talk a little bit about what you're referring to?
So the perceivers mentioned that they would see different colors. So, if the Reiki master was over a specific part of the body, many of the perceivers might see a color blue and associate that with the cooling of that organ. Or if they were in another area, there was a lot of talk of like clearing blocks, clearing energy. So it might start off being red, and then the redness would move out of the body into the space.
Thank
Those
you.
are just a couple examples, yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Check out the paper. There's many more details I didn't get to go through. Thanks a lot.
Okay, next from the University of Utah, Eric Garland. Do you know what to do here?
I'll figure it out. Or maybe not. There we go. So it's a pleasure to be here today. My name is Eric Garland. I'm a distinguished professor at the University of Utah and also the director of our Center on Mindfulness and Integrative Health Intervention Development. And today I'm going to be talking about the effects of mindfulness on inducing endogenous theta stimulation in the prefrontal cortex as a means of enhancing the experience of self-transcendence and thereby improving self-control over addictive behavior. And I apologize, I was expecting to have a little bit more time for this talk, so I'm going to move quickly through the introductory material. So in 2015, Nobel Prize-winning economists Case and Deaton found that for the first time in many decades, the US mortality rate was rising precipitously, to which they attributed in large part to the opioid crisis, a crisis that has been termed a disease of despair. And I don't think this term disease of despair is a mere metaphor, but I think it actually strikes right at the heart of the pathogenic mechanisms that are driving this crisis. To understand this claim, we need to understand the role that hedonic dysregulation plays in pain, pleasure, and addiction. Traditionally, in Western philosophy, pleasure and pain have been considered opposites on a hedonic balance, such that increasing experiences of pain are thought to outweigh the pleasure and meaning derived from naturally rewarding objects and events in the social environment. Modern neurobiology suggests that pleasure and pain are not mere opposites, but rather operate through a common emotional currency in the brain, mediated by the mesocorticolimbic dopamine circuit and the endogenous opioid system. And these same hedonic neural circuits become hijacked by addictive drugs like opioids through an allostatic process, in which increasing use of drugs results in enhanced sensitivity to pain, stress, and drug-related cues, and comes to outweigh the pleasure and meaning derived from naturally rewarding objects and events in the social environment. So in other words, as the individual becomes more and more dependent on opioids to feel okay, they become less able to extract a natural, healthy sense of pleasure out of everyday life. And this drives them to take higher and higher doses of the drug to preserve a dwindling sense of well-being. As a result of this cycle, opioid use and pain become entrenched as automatic habits and entangled into the default mode of the self. One's identity becomes bound up with addiction and pain. And this downward spiral ultimately leads to the loss of self-control, that is self-regulation, over cognitive and behavioral automaticity, resulting in opioid addiction. Consequently, then, cognitive control is a key mechanism in addiction, and therefore it behooves us to consider the neural mechanisms subserving cognitive control. One key mechanism, neurophysiological mechanism of cognitive control, is frontal midline theta oscillations in the prefrontal cortex, particularly in regions including the medial prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate. Indeed, frontal theta signals a common mechanism for invoking a shift from prepotent, that is habitual, model-free, or striatal, to deliberative, goal-oriented, or model-based or prefrontal control over action selection. In other words, frontal midline theta may become engaged when one activates meta-awareness of one's automatic habits. And we know that, in fact, frontal midline theta increases as the brain's default mode network decreases. Rakel showed that when one is engaged in a demanding task that requires cognitive control, there are characteristic patterns of deactivation in the medial prefrontal cortex, the precuneus, and the posterior cingulate, the default mode network. Conversely, DMN activity increases when the brain is at rest in the absence of cognitively demanding tasks. And as was mentioned by our first speaker, the default mode network has been thought to subserve self-referential processing and potentially instantiate the sense of self or the ego. It represents our automatic habits of thinking when our mind is wandering. So frontal midline theta may actually be an index of default mode network activation. As default mode network activation decreases, frontal midline theta increases. And we know from a large body of work here reviewed by the director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, Marjorie Woollcott, that addiction involves aberrant functioning in the default mode network with hyperactivity in the posterior cingulate cortex and decreased functional connectivity, decreased functional connectivity between the medial prefrontal cortex and the default mode network. So as addiction develops, adaptive cognitive control becomes usurped by drug-related reward processing, whereby drug cues become overvalued and they elicit automatic drug-seeking responses at the expense of the pursuit of homeostatic goals. Therefore, what would be a natural treatment for addiction then would be an intervention that could modulate the function of the default mode network via stimulation of theta oscillations in the brain. And mindfulness meditation represents a viable candidate then. We know from actually from meta-analyses that not only does mindfulness increase DMN activity, but it also increases frontal midline theta. But few studies have examined whether mindfulness can increase frontal midline theta in patients with clinical disorders. And to my knowledge, no prior studies have examined whether mindfulness-induced frontal midline theta actually mediates the treatment effect of mindfulness on the reduction of clinical symptoms. So my primary hypothesis is that frontal midline theta will mediate the effect of mindfulness on reducing addictive behavior. My second hypothesis is that mindfulness-induced frontal midline theta will be associated with alterations in default mode self-referential processing, and specifically be associated with the experience of self-transcendence, the sense of oneness between the self and the universe. So in this study, we studied a particular mindfulness-based intervention, and that is mindfulness-oriented recovery enhancement, which is a therapy that I developed that unites complementary aspects of mindfulness training, third wave cognitive behavioral therapy, and principles from positive psychology into a treatment that can simultaneously address addictive behavior, stress, and chronic pain. More is a sequence treatment. It begins with the foundation of mindfulness training, which by virtue of enhancing attentional control and meta-awareness is theorized to synergize more elaborate therapeutic techniques like reappraisal and savoring, and ultimately lead towards self-transcendence, the sense of being connected to something greater than the self. These treatment components are intended to modulate a series of therapeutic mechanisms that are in turn intended to produce clinically significant change in a range of treatment targets relevant to chronic pain and opioid addiction. Very briefly here, I just want to describe the meditation techniques taught in the Moore intervention. So we teach chronic pain patients who are at risk for opioid addiction to deal with pain by using mindfulness to remove the emotional overlay that exacerbates nociceptive processing in the brain, and to break down the pain experience into its subcomponent sensations. So rather than focusing on some terrible, awful anguish in one's back, we teach people to use mindfulness to zoom into the sensation, to the experience of pain, and to break it down into sensations of heat or tightness or tingling, as well as to notice the spaces in between those sensations where there's either no sensation at all or potentially pleasant sensations right next to the painful ones. And we use a very similar technique to help patients to cope with craving for opioids by breaking the craving down into its cognitive, emotional, and sensorial components. But similarly, as the meditative practice deepens, there's a shift from zooming into sensation and deconstructing sensation to a zooming out not only from sensation, but zooming out from all experience and observing experience from a lens of metacognitive awareness. Not only do we begin to notice that thoughts, emotions, and body sensations come and go and fade away on their own, as the meditation reaches its apex, participants are guided to become aware of the background field of awareness in which all experience exists. And ultimately, we encourage the patient to experience a sense of unification with the background field of awareness. There's one other technique that you may find interesting in the Moore intervention, and that is the savoring technique. We teach patients savoring by having them focus mindfulness on a beautiful rose. We guide them to appreciate the pleasant colors, textures, and scent of the flower, as well as the touch of its petals against the skin. During this process, patients are guided to cultivate a metacognitive, reflective attitude and to notice the arising of any positive emotions or pleasant body sensations during the experience of savoring. And this technique is intended to promote, to amplify natural reward processing in the brain, promote analgesia, and elicit experiences of self-transcendence, that is, the sense of interconnectedness between the self and the world. There's a lot I could say about this subject. I don't have a ton of time here, but what I want you to think about from this framework here is that savoring may actually be a process of experiencing transcendence, because savoring involves the sense of contact between the subject and the object. Focusing on the sense of contact between the subject and the object is essentially accessing the sense of interconnectedness between the self and the world. So therefore, savoring may increase awareness of oneness and elicit self-transcendence, And as self-transcendence deepens, absorption into the object produces bliss. And ultimately, attention may disengage from the object and turn back upon itself to savor the blissful field of consciousness beyond the object. And I'm going to blaze past this. I'm going to blaze past this too, although this is a wonderful quote. So how did we measure self-transcendence in this study? We used an instrument that my colleague, Dr. Adam Hanley, and I developed called the NADA, the Non-Dual Awareness Dimensional Assessment. Here are 3 question items that represent the items on the NADA. There are items that tap the sense of annihilational transcendence. There are items that tap the sense of relational transcendence, that is the sense of oneness. And there are items that tap the affective bliss that attends the sense of unity. Dr. Hanley is going to talk in more detail about the psychometric development of this instrument, if you're interested. Briefly, from a clinical perspective, we found that the mindfulness-oriented recovery and enhancement intervention can increase a wide array of positive psychological processes. These are data from a randomized controlled trial that we published in the Journal of Consulting and Clinical Psychology a few years ago. And we found that not only did more increase self-transcendence, but importantly, the effect of more on reducing pain severity and opioid misuse was statistically mediated by the effect of more on an array of positive psychological functions, including self-transcendence. And self-transcendence was the most robust predictor of improvements in clinical symptoms. So recently, we published the largest clinical trial of more to date in the high-impact journal, JAMA Internal Medicine. This was a NIH-funded randomized controlled trial, a 5-year, $2.8 million trial, and involved 250 opioid misusing patients with fairly severe pain and high levels of opioid use. And in summary of the findings, more was exceptionally powerful as a treatment for addiction, highly efficacious. More reduced opioid misuse by 45%, 9 months after the 8-week treatment. So more is clearly an efficacious therapy for reducing opioid use. And in fact, more was more than twice as powerful as standard supportive psychotherapy at reducing opioid misuse. We also found that more significantly decreased chronic pain and emotional distress. But this is all background material to talk to you about what you're here to hear about. So we were interested in whether more could modulate self-transcendent experiences and how self-transcendent experiences might be linked to reduced addictive behavior. So in another randomized controlled trial involving 63 opioid-treated veterans, they participated in more or 8 weeks of supportive psychotherapy. We brought them into the lab and asked them to practice mindfulness meditation while we measured their EEG. And we found that more significantly enhanced frontal midline theta oscillations in the midline of the brain. Interestingly, these increased frontal midline theta oscillations were significantly correlated with increased experiences of self-transcendence during meditation. So patients who experienced the greatest sense of unity or oneness or dissolution of the self showed the greatest increases in frontal midline theta. But critically, the effect of more on reducing opioid use was statistically mediated by increases in frontal midline theta during meditation, suggesting that more was actually enhancing cognitive control. And this mindfulness-induced endogenous theta stimulation may be providing increased self-control over addictive behavior. But then we conducted an even larger replication study. So these are data from the NIDA-funded, the NIH-funded R01 grant that I mentioned a few moments ago. So not only did we collect clinical data that was recently published in JAMA, we also collected EEG during the trial. So we got EEG data on a sample of 165 opioid misusers. This was a randomized controlled trial comparing mindfulness-oriented recovery enhancement or standard supportive psychotherapy. We brought them into the lab. We asked them to practice mindfulness meditation. And again, we measured their EEG. And in a second independent randomized controlled trial, we found that mindfulness-oriented recovery enhancement increased frontal midline theta oscillations in the brain during mindfulness meditation enhancing both frontal midline theta power as well as frontal midline theta coherence. We also found that mindfulness-oriented recovery enhancement significantly increased the trait propensity towards self-transcendence. And you can see the effects of this mindfulness intervention on the experience of self-transcendence were actually strengthened and maintained 9 months after the end of the 8-week intervention. But critically, again, increases in the phenomenological correlates of self-transcendence, so the sense of unity as well as the sense of bliss occasioned during mindfulness meditation practice, were significantly correlated with increases in frontal midline theta. And the crux of this study, importantly, we found that the effects of mindfulness-oriented recovery enhancement on reducing opioid misuse through the 9-month follow-up point were again statistically mediated by increases in frontal midline theta power during mindfulness meditation. So this is amazing. If you know this field, you know this field of meditation research, getting replications across multiple trials is a very rare thing. So now we have 2 randomized controlled trials showing that mindfulness-oriented recovery enhancement is reducing addictive behavior by increasing frontal midline theta during mindfulness meditation. And this increase in frontal midline theta activation is correlated with self-transcendence. So now, why would an increased marker of cognitive control be linked to self-transcendence? Well, we have an answer from that from the ancient Kashmir Shaiva Tantras. At the time when the adept pervades all things that exist on the plane of objectivity by his cognitive intent and envelops them with the light of consciousness so as to internalize them within it, his erroneous perception of multiplicity ceases, and so he brings all things to rest together in the one reality. So essentially, the focused attention leading to samadhi is the portal to experiencing transcendence. And in this ancient tradition is also, of course, a prediction of the findings that I showed you today, because it was held that transcendence was a means of abolishing craving. Then, when the yogi is established in pure awareness, his craving is destroyed, and so the individual soul ceases to exist. This impure craving thus persists together with the conditioned ego due to his diluted experience. When his consciousness develops and rises to the level of the pure perceiving subject, thus he savors his own inherently blissful nature, which illumines itself with the rays of its consciousness. Thus, at that very moment, the yogi abandons the craving. So, finally, and hypothetically, meditative self-transcendence might produce a potent experience of natural reward and stimulus-independent happiness linked with increased theta oscillations in the medial prefrontal cortex and increased integration of task-positive brain networks involved in sensory processing with task-negative brain works involved in self-referential processing. Modulating functional connectivity patterns via self-transcendence might reset aberrant default mode brain function in chronic pain and addiction and facilitate the restructuring of reward processing in corticostriatal circuitry underlying addictive behavior. So in conclusion, 2 independent randomized controlled trials replicate the following. Mindfulness-oriented recovery enhancement increases frontal midline theta during mindfulness practice. Frontal midline theta is associated with self-transcendence. Frontal midline theta mediates the effect of more on reduced addictive behavior. The phenomenology of transcendence, marked by a sense of non-duality between the self and the world, and a rapturous affective tone of blissful reward, might not be mere epiphenomena, but rather track with the mechanistic changes occasioned by mindfulness practice. And ultimately, endogenous theta stimulation produced by transcendent meditative states might reset the default mode dysfunction that undergirds addiction. So I want to thank you for your attention. I want to thank the National Institutes of Health, the Department of Defense, and my great collaborators. So thank you.
Thanks so much. I'll ask a quick question.
Yes.
This is very impressive. Thank you for taking us through it quickly. So is it indicated that the increase in transcendence is actually central to the decrease in the addictive tendency?
Great question. So in these data that I showed you, it really was the frontal midline theta that was driving the reduction in the addictive behavior. And so one might think that the self-transcendence is, as I said, maybe the epiphenomena of the underlying brain activation that's driving the addictive behavior. However, if you all know statistics, you can pretty much use statistics to show anything you want to show. And so I could certainly reconstruct the models in such a way where frontal midline, where self-transcendence is trumping frontal midline theta. So I think really they're two sides of the same coin, quite frankly. I mean, but I'm not a reductionist by any means, but I think that I think the experience of self-transcendence clearly has therapeutic impact, and its signature is in part this frontal midline theta. So when they're both in the model, they kind of swamp each other's variance, and so you don't see the effect of the self-report that well. But the experience of self-transcendence is correlated with improved clinical outcomes in my data. So thank you.
Good evening. Have you had such an experience yourself?
Yes.
How would you say that the common use of the word love or transcendence in the common vernacular fully describes your experience, fully comprehends it?
I think the experience carries the quality of love, but I don't think that love fully encapsulates the experience. I think in my experience, the experience of transcendence, well, obviously it's ineffable, right? And so that's one of the ways in which we try to characterize it.
Well, my point, of course, has to do with language and with the power of words, or the lack of power in this particular case, to grasp what it is we're actually talking about. Now, you and I, having had that experience, could have that conversation. We might understand what we're saying. But anybody who is not in that realm could use the word love, can use the word transcendence, can use the word ineffable, and not have the slightest clue about the true nature of the word. I would suggest that somebody smarter than me comes up with new words that might take an entire paragraph to fully comprehend the real meaning, or so that these common words, which are used in all this research and then somehow correlated but not, is changed and more accurate.
It's a great point. It's a great point. And we this was our crude attempt to develop an instrument to quantitatively measure this phenomenon. It really had not been done extensively before, and it certainly had not, the quantitative metric of transcendence had certainly not been correlated with improved clinical outcomes in any clinical condition, to my knowledge. So this was our first attempt, but clearly it's a crude instrument, and we can do better, and we want to do better.
Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. And I understand you're interested in research, and I'm more from the application point of view. So my question is, were you able to implement your wonderful more method in the actual application, say with the VA's hospital, or license it to the yoga studio to benefit your future research and the society as a whole?
Thank you for the question. So really, that is at this stage of my career, one very important focus of my work is dissemination of this highly effective treatment, and training clinicians to employ this. So to date, I've trained more than 500 social workers, psychologists, nurses, and physicians to deliver this therapy to people suffering from chronic pain and addiction around the U.S. and internationally. But I want to expand that work because, as you saw in the JAMA paper, it is a highly efficacious therapy and needs to be disseminated. So thank you.
Okay, now from Japan, Hidehiko Saegusa.
Hello, my name is Hide Saegusa from Japan. I have been doing a research on enlightenment and awakening for last 33 years. And I have studied 15 years in India. Transmission of awakening or consciousness has been practiced for many years, especially in India and also in Japan. They have a special word for it. It is called Shaktipat in Sanskrit, or Diksha in Sanskrit. I'm an expert on transmission of consciousness. Since March 7th, experiment on my transmission of awakening has started in Arizona University's Center for Consciousness Studies. This is my experience of the first day in the laboratory, which I transmitted my awakening to the person, and she experienced a very deep awakening. But strangely, the data from these experiences that I didn't reach me. Many things happened. I wasn't able to provide the scientific data of the experiment. But many more experiment is planned on my transmission of awakening in Center for Consciousness. I live in Tokyo, Japan, but I was persuaded by the professor, and I decided to start living in Tucson and engage myself in all kinds of experiment in laboratory. Transmission of awakening is awakened person transmit their awakening to person in front of you. There are many ways to transmit awakening. Techniques of transmission has been kept very secret and handed down only to deeply awakened students. But if you become very deeply into the awakening, these techniques will be automatically disclosed to you. Effectiveness of transmission of awakening depends on how deep you are awakened and how much energy you are born with. I started this workshop to transmit awakening in Japan. It was 2020, July, right in the middle of the COVID. But still, 100 people participated. And up to now, I was able to put 80% of people into very deep samadhi. They experienced enlightenment, glimpse of it, during my 3-hour seminar. And many people have attained complete shift into awakening in just participating one or a few seminars. For example, these are the pictures from my seminar in Japan. This person, Miss Mimi, has written a detailed experience of her awakening in her blog. After just participating in one seminar, she experienced intense bliss for 3 days continuously and shifted permanently into enlightenment. And after 1 year, she wrote me again. Great, and he was saying that great change has happened in my life. So thank you very much. Actually, I came to Tucson to buy a gemstone in February. I'm a gemstone dealer. And the world's biggest gemstone exhibition is happening in Tucson. And I was shopping gemstone and crystal for 1 month. Then on my way back to Japan, I just visited Center for Consciousness Study. And after 8 days, my experiment had started in the Center for Consciousness. And Mr. Stuart Hameroff invited me to his dinner 5 times, to his house 7 times, to the basketball 2 times, and we became very, very close friends. And he persuaded me to stay here, live here in Tucson, and do a lot of experiment with him. I have received so many transmissions of awakening from many teachers around the world, like almost like 30 people. But I didn't feel anything during the transmission. Usually after the transmission, I start to feel the change. I think direct transmission is absolutely the fastest way for the spiritual progress. And these are the testimonials of the people who received my workshop. I only felt gratitude and was deeply touched. Tears was unstoppable and deep healing happened. I'm absolutely beginner and never ever meditated before, but when Hide came close to me in meditation, transmission session, he transmitted intense energy from top of my head till toe. I was really stunned. I felt I was surrounded by blissful energy, and joy and love was overflowing from inside of me and was really moved. During meditation transmission, I saw a very bright light and felt overwhelming blissful energy. Transmission of awakening, transmission of consciousness is a very sensitive and important issue, especially right now. Because if consciousness doesn't exist, transmission is not going to happen. That is the reason they asked me to stay here and do the experiment of transmission. And I tried with the Zoom in the Japanese academic conference, and it also worked. And I want to talk about my other research about 11 levels of well-being and happiness. I think it's a little bit difficult to read, so I printed the paper. So if you are interested, please come and pick up the paper. And this is 11 levels, and 11 is the final goal of the spiritual practice. Total unconditional love and total relaxation. And this I categorize with the length of breathing. Final goal is more than 50 seconds of breath. Inhale and exhale, I count as 1. If you go deeper and deeper, breathing gonna go longer than 50 seconds. The first step, when I went to India, when I was 22 years old, and I stayed in India for 15 years. First year, I was level 1. My breathing was 2 to 5 seconds breath. And I was not able to meditate. For these people, meditation doesn't happen. Mindfulness doesn't work. They need a lot of healing and mental condition and social adaptability, depression and mental issue, and cannot adapt to the society. And second level is 5 to 10 seconds. They can meditate. Meditation going to start happening. But still has a medium depression and mental issue. But they could adapt to the society. They could start working. And number 3 is 10 to 15 seconds. They're going to feel firm in meditation. Sometimes get still depressed, but can adapt very well to the society. Number 4, 15 to 20 seconds. Bliss happens during meditation. Bliss going to start happening. Number 5 is 20 to 25 seconds. You're going to get overwhelmed by bliss during meditation. And from number 6 is a dimension of enlightenment. I spent so many years with the Indian saints, and all of them had a very deep breathing. And they were immersed in deep bliss and happiness all the time, and had an extraordinary ability. And from number 6, bliss is going to continue in daily life. And after breath is getting deeper than the 25 seconds, your spine is going to be very flexible. So automatically, you will be able to get enlightened. And number 6, effort and action brings much more result than expected. And extraordinary ability starts to come out. I went through all these processes. I'm now at number 10. And number 7 is breath is 30 to 35 seconds. Effortlessly things happen and get amazing result. And extraordinary ability becomes firm. After level 6, you will be able to go into the database of your brain as much as you like. So after 6, everybody could read people's mind, because if you could go into the database of our brain, we could remember the facial expression and the result. If we could go into that memory, reading people's mind is very easy. And number 8, 35 to 40 seconds. From here, you could be able to predict the future. I use in my business, I own one of the biggest jewelry and gemstone company in Japan. But I only have to work 10 minutes a day. Because for me, predicting the future is very easy with 100% accuracy. I never make mistake in my decision making. Then you only have to work 10 minutes a day and be able to sustain the business. So your life is going to become very, very effective after level 6. And things going to happen effortlessly, always very, very good luck. And you're going to be able to use extraordinary ability in business and in daily life. And number 9 is 40 to 5 seconds. Almost everything you desired going to get fulfilled. And extraordinary ability can completely lead your life. Everything you could see, you could predict. So it's going to be a very different types of life. And number 10, 45 to 50 seconds. Right now, I'm here. And your spine and neck is going to be completely flexible. I ask people to touch my spine in my workshop. I have no tension at all. That's the reason I think the brain activity is going to get intensified after level 6. But I still have one tension in my back. That's why I'm still number 10. But everything you desire will be fulfilled. Always super good luck and extraordinary ability reaches close to maximum potential. I wanted to talk more about this kind of extraordinary ability. But I think today my time is 15 minutes. And I actually wanted to demonstrate my ability of transmitting awakening. But I think I have to close my talk. So tomorrow, 11 o'clock at my room, 3110, if you could come to my room, I will demonstrate my ability to transmit my awakening. Thank you very much. Tomorrow, 11 o'clock at my room at 3110. In this hotel. I stay in this hotel. And there I'm going to demo my ability to transmit awakening. No. Yes.
I have to leave at 8 o'clock in the morning and I can't come to your session, which I'm very disappointed.
Oh, okay. I will do it tonight. Can we meet tonight? If somebody is leaving tomorrow morning, early morning, I will do it tonight. What time would you like? Right now? If you have any space, it's going to take like 5 minutes per person. Or I can do it.
Do me, I'd be so.
No. I can do it to the whole. I can do it to the 100 people at once. So 5 minutes. Okay. So can we meditate? Can we meditate together for 5 minutes? I'm gonna walk around, and I'm gonna do my transmission. Okay. 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I hope everybody can hear me. I had some problems just hearing, but I expect that it's my turn. So I will start sharing this screen.
Corina Greven is also remote presenter. Thank you.
Perfect. Now I can hear you. Thank you very much. Quite a change from the session of Dr. Saegusa. My name is Corina Greven, and I'm a professor of psychology at the Radboud University Medical Center in Nijmegen in the Netherlands. And I'm very happy to be able to talk to you about my research on mindfulness-based intervention for children with ADHD and their parents, effects on symptoms, insight, and awareness. So what motivated me to come here to this conference is that we already learned in previous sessions during this conference that mindfulness is also related to altered states of consciousness, such as increased insight, changed meaning, and the experience of unity, all of which can be perceived as healing, but which are classically not studied or considered important in the field of child and adolescent psychiatry that I come from. So my attempt here during this presentation is to interpret it with a broadened mindset and with this in mind. So ADHD, as defined by the DSM-5, is an early onset neurodevelopmental disorder, is characterized by symptoms of inattentiveness and hyperactivity impulsivity that are developmentally inappropriate. Prevalence of ADHD is about 5% in children and adolescents and about 2.5% in adults. What is often not known is that ADHD also comes with many positive traits. Most broadly studied enhanced creativity. So people with ADHD are on average more creative, especially in aspects of divergent thinking compared to people without ADHD. But at the same time, ADHD symptoms often come with serious impairment for which interventions are needed. ADHD often affects the whole family system. Parents of children with ADHD often have more parenting stress, show more overreactive parenting, and parents of children with ADHD are also more likely to have ADHD or other psychiatric symptoms themselves. And part of this relationship is, of course, genetic, heritable, but at the same time, there's also a mutually reinforcing relationship between child and parent behavior problems. Care as usual for ADHD consists of psychoeducation, that is structured information about ADHD, in combination with medication, most typically stimulants, and or cognitive behavioral interventions. However, not everybody responds to these treatments, and there is a significant group of children where remaining symptoms and impairment continue. And that is why we're interested to see whether mindfulness-based intervention may be a useful add-on intervention to care as usual. So we already heard something about mindfulness. This is the definition of mindfulness, an operational definition by Bishop et al. And they say that mindfulness has two key components. The first has to do with the self-regulation of attention to the present moment. So the classical exercise where you focus your attention on your breathing, and then your attention may wander and you bring your attention back to your breathing. The second component has to do with the orientation to experience. So you pay attention to the present moment, but with an attitude of non-judgment and curiosity and friendliness, compassion. Maybe you can already see from this very definition of mindfulness how this can be relevant for children with ADHD, because ADHD, of course, has at its core problems with self-regulation, but mindfulness may also help more with this attitudinal component in terms of accepting, having, and living with ADHD, as well as gaining insight in ADHD symptoms. Previous research on mindfulness-based intervention for children with ADHD, as summarized in meta-analysis, find that mindfulness-based intervention works in terms of reducing ADHD symptoms, especially inattentiveness with a medium effect size. However, most of these studies had power issues, few were randomized controlled trials, also few included parents, although we do know that if parents of children with ADHD have ADHD symptoms themselves, then the intervention typically is less effective. And lastly, most results had ADHD symptoms as the main outcome, rather than considering a broader set of outcomes that families with ADHD perceive as important. So this is why we set up the MindChamp study. This is an acronym that stands for Mindfulness Training for Children with ADHD and Mindful Parenting, study that was conducted by my PhD student, Nienke Siebelink, whom you can see here. The study is pre-registered and protocolized, and we have a quantitative and a qualitative part to the study and conducted power analyses. So in MindChamp, we use the so-called My Mind training. This is a mindfulness intervention that was developed by Professor Susanne Beugels from the University of Amsterdam. And My Mind consists of two parts. There's a mindfulness-based cognitive therapy given to the child, and in parallel, a mindful parenting training given to the parents. So in essence, you have children together practicing in one room and parents practicing together in another room, and some of the sessions are also together. There are 8 weekly sessions of 1.5 hours, 4 to 8 children together in a group, and there's also daily homework. Importantly, the whole training is adjusted to the needs of families with ADHD. For example, there are shorter meditations and more variety, making this My Mind training very feasible for this group. In terms of some of the key inclusion criteria, children had to be between 8 and 16 years old, have a primary diagnosis of ADHD. Medication was allowed, but it had to be stable, or an informed decision had to be made on not taking medication. And all children had to be receiving care as usual, but still have remaining symptoms. All children were recruited from Karakter, which is a network of child and adolescent psychiatric clinics in the southeast of the Netherlands. And we recruited 103 families with ADHD, whom we randomized to either mindfulness as an addition as care as usual or as care as usual only. So we answer here the clinically relevant question whether mindfulness is a useful addition to care as usual. We did a diagnostic interview at baseline to confirm the ADHD diagnosis. We also took questionnaires from parent, teacher, and the child themselves. And we also took neurocognitive assessments. However, this neurocognitive part is currently work in progress by my postdoc, so I will not be showing this. Then we had an assessment 8 weeks later after the intervention or care as usual. And then we had a 2 and a 6 months follow-up assessment to study long-term effects. And you can see from the sample size here on the left and the right, the numbers are relatively similar, meaning we had very low dropouts. As our primary outcome, we focused on child self-control. And by that, we mean everyday problems with controlling impulses, switching attention, regulating emotional responses, and initiating or organizing tasks. And we focused on self-control rather than ADHD symptoms, which is the classic outcome, because self-control is a cross-disorder construct that also occurs in several internalizing and externalizing problems, and is also highly predictive of future mental health and physical health, financial outcomes, and so forth. Used a multi-rater, multi-method approach. Primary outcome was this questionnaire on child self-control called the brief, as rated by the parent. We also had teacher ratings on this brief, as probably blinded ratings, neurocognitive tasks, as I said, which I'm not showing. And then we had a range of other outcomes beyond self-control, namely other psychological symptoms, well-being, and measures related to mindfulness. And I'll be focusing in my presentation on presenting results on the primary outcome, and the other results I'll just, in the interest of time, give in a more condensed and summarized form. In terms of analysis, we used ANCOVAs on child self-control deficits, parent rated as our primary outcome. The dependent variable was, the brief, measuring, what I just said. The independent variable group, so mindfulness plus care as usual was care as usual only, and covariate was this brief questionnaire self-control at baseline. So the ANCOs are group-based analysis that say something at the level, of groups, but we were also interested at the level of the individual. And for this, we used analysis called the reliable change index. And in essence, this answers the question whether change in an individual's brief score is significant based on the reliability of a measure. In terms of baseline characteristics, you can see here the mindfulness plus care as usual group and the care as usual group, and the two columns, the numbers are relatively similar, so our randomization worked well. On average, in both groups, children were about 11 years old, about 70% males, about 80% currently on ADHD medication. Almost all of them had previous treatment for ADHD, mostly medication. And here you can see the scores of inattentiveness, hyperactivity, impulsivity, and self-control. And you can see that about 2/3 of the sample had either clinical, shown in red, or subclinical, shown in orange, inattentiveness, hyperactivity, impulsivity, and self-control deficits. So even though this is a group that already had so much treatment, that were in a tertiary care clinic, that received high quality care according to current child psychiatric practices, they still had significant symptoms. So this is a group with rather severe symptoms and that did not respond to care as usual. These are our primary results on our primary outcome that we were powered on. So you can see on the x-axis post-treatment, 2 months follow-up and 6 months follow-up. So note this is not baseline, but it's post-treatment corrected for baseline. And the y-axis plotted, you can see parent-rated brief scores, brief child self-control deficit scores, corrected for baseline. And you can see that the mindfulness plus care as usual group here in purple, they had lower self-control deficits at post-treatment, 2 months follow-up and 6 months follow-up, compared to the care as usual group in orange. The effect size was about, these are Cohen's d, so about 0.2, 0.3, so this is a small effect size. However, none of these effects were significant. So in essence, we have a negative trial. Then we also conducted this individual-based analysis on the reliable change index. So what you can see here is every dot or triangle represents one individual, and everybody within this gray shaded area, this 95% confidence interval area, did neither significantly improve or deteriorate. And you were above this gray shaded area significantly deteriorated on child self-control deficits as rated by the parent, and everybody below it significantly improved. And you can see that there are many more of these purple dots below this gray shaded area. In fact, 32% improved in the mindfulness plus care as usual group, whereas only 10% in the care as usual group. And the number of needed to treat was 5. Number of needed to treat means that if we were to treat 5 families with mindfulness plus care as usual, at least one additional family would improve, whereas the other 4 would either improve or not improve, just as if they had received care as usual only. So this is the number you want to be as low as possible. And in fact, the 5 number needed to treat of 5 is comparable to stimulant use for ADHD, stimulant medication. A short summary of the other outcomes. So in the children, we also found that in the mindfulness group, there was improvement in ADHD symptoms, anxiety, problems falling asleep, and self-control at school as rated by the teacher. These were small effect sizes that were only shown in the short term, straight after the intervention, but in the long term, these effects were not maintained. In parents, we found medium to large effects. You found improvements in mindful parenting, psychological well-being, and ADHD symptoms. And in the long term, we found that additional effects appeared, such as those on self-compassion and depression, anxiety, and stress. So some of these effects took some time to develop. And we also found that some of the effect sizes got larger in the long term in the parents. In addition to the quantitative study, we also conducted a qualitative part, the interview part, because we were interested in whether there may have been any outcomes that we assessed in the RCT that maybe we missed, that maybe through inquiring what people perceived, we would find different results, because our quantitative measures were still mainly focused on symptoms. So what we did here, we recruited participants from the RCT. From the mindfulness group, we used purposive sampling, meaning we tried to get a diverse group from this sample, and ultimately interviewed parents, children, and mindfulness teacher, did audio recordings that we transcribed and then analyzed using grounded theory. A short overview of what we found. First of all, perceived effects were very heterogeneous. So different families experienced effects on different domains, which can also explain why it was hard to find things at the group level. In addition, also this treatment that we used, or this intervention, was set up as a treatment for child ADHD symptoms. But in fact, from the interviews, it emerged the possible effects were not limited to ADHD symptoms or symptoms. In fact, the effect on symptoms was not at the forefront in the perception of families, while at the same time, almost all of them were unanimously positive about the training. Where they did, for example, report perceived effects that they considered as meaningful and important, had to do with increased awareness and insight that we did not measure in our quantitative results. So, for example, parents for the first time said, suddenly became aware that they have ADHD symptoms themselves, which also gave them insight into their child's symptoms. They also found improvements in relational changes, especially parents reported being less reactive in their parenting, which had a big influence on family climate. And a third example to name here is that of acceptance. So we had parents come to us for the first realizing and admitting that they were actually embarrassed of the child and that their child was different. Whereas through the mindfulness, they were able to be less judgmental and take a different mental attitude or a different perspective and be more accepting of their child. And if that doesn't have a massive influence on the child, to have your parent be more accepting of you, that would really surprise me. So to summarize, this was the first pre-registered randomized controlled trial examining the efficacy of family-based mindfulness intervention in addition to care as usual, whereas care as usual only. We had a tertiary care sample of children with ADHD and insufficient prior response to treatment. We found no significant improvement in our primary outcome. So in the clinical trials, you always have to specify one primary outcome, which was child self-control problems. We didn't find anything there, so we have a negative trial. However, in secondary analysis, we found that a subgroup of children did indeed improve in parent-rated self-control, that there were larger and more durable effects in the parents. And lastly, we found that insight and awareness, acceptance, and improved parental non-reactivity were perceived by families as central to treatment effectiveness. Lastly, I would like to thank everybody involved in running this study and the funding bodies. And if you're interested in this, our two papers on this, the RCT and the qualitative study, are published now, as well as the PhD thesis of my PhD student, Nienke Siebelink, is publicly available. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. Is there a quick question? Okay, thank you again.
Thank you.
So next, also from the University of Utah, Adam Hanley.
All right, so in the interest of time, I'm gonna hopefully keep this a little brief and try to pick the slides that are just most salient to this gathering. So I'm Adam Hanley. I work as an assistant professor at the University of Utah Center on Mindfulness and Integrative Health Intervention Development, which Eric, you just heard from, is the director. And really what I want to do today is present to you results from two brief randomized clinical trials that are suggesting that self-transcendent states can occur in a general sample of surgical pain patients during brief mindfulness training. We'll talk about how brief in a second. And that these self-transcendent states are associated with immediate decreases in clinical symptomology. And finally, that these preoperative self-transcendent experiences predict better long-term patient outcomes over time. But before we get clinical outcomes, I just kind of want to characterize how we're talking about transcendence here, as the earlier question may suggest is useful. So we're drawing from Yaden and colleagues' work here and defining transcendence as this mental state, a transient mental state that's characterized by an altered sense of self, in particular, a reduction in self-salience, as well as an expansive emotional tone like bliss, awe, or joy. Now, alterations in this sense of self often happen in one of two characteristic ways. Some folks report feeling like they're becoming absorbed by something greater than themselves, this sort of oneness with the universe experience. And this is sometimes referred to as relational unity. And at other times, people talk about their sense of self kind of melting, dissolving away. And people sometimes talk of this as annihilational unity. And acknowledging there's a lot more nuance here. Hopefully that's enough detail to get us started. The other thing that I wanted to touch on in the conceptualization here is that I think there's a continuum of altered states of consciousness. I think Hide brought this up a minute ago with the 0 to 11 scale. There's all sorts of hierarchical taxonomies of altered states that have been proposed across time, many with dizzying precision. On the right side of the screen there, you see the 36 tattvas of Kashmir Shaivism. On the left side, you see Dusana Dorji's kind of more modern characterization here. And so I really want to emphasize that when I say self-transcendence in this talk, I'm really referring to a range of sort of phenomenological experience. It's not a discrete either or, fully transcended, not transcended. I think there's variation in this experience. And I think really what we're pointing at here is sort of a step or two above kind of that immersive experience that we often have in daily life, kind of caught up in thoughts, feelings, and sensations. So self-transcendence has long been theorized to be a therapeutic mechanism of mindfulness, but it's been largely neglected in our clinical trials of mindfulness-based interventions. Historically, our mindfulness-based interventions, as the previous speaker referred to, have sort of focused on this idea of acceptance, mindfulness cultivating self-regulation. But we really haven't looked at that closely at transcendence. I think this neglect probably arises for a lot of reasons, but one of them is an absence of kind of a standardized sort of quick measurement approach. So we developed the NADA. Eric alluded to this earlier. I have a fair amount of psychometric nonsense in here that I was going to talk about, but in, again, the interest of time, we're going to blaze right through that. So we did a lot of work here to try to figure out the best items. People reported these items more often than we expected. 70% of folks said, I have an experience of self-transcendence in my lifetime. 85% said I experienced bliss in my lifetime, which is a higher percentage than I would have expected going into this. Replicated the structure, found that it correlated with like type theoretical constructs and metapersonal self-construal, inclusion of others in the sense of self. That known group validity was observed. So meditation practitioners reported higher NADA scores than non-practitioners. More practice was associated with higher scores. So some good validity checks there. And then from these 13 final items, we used item response theory analyses to pick the 3 that worked best. One grabbing attentional or annihilational awareness, another grabbing relational unity, and then the third grabbing that sort of expansive emotion of bliss. And I'm really focusing on this 3-item scale. And we needed this 3-item scale to kind of fit seamlessly into clinical settings. And that's where our first study is taking place. So we examined the self-transcendent states in the University of Utah's Orthopedic Center among patients that were undergoing knee or hip replacement surgery. The outcomes from our primary clinical outcomes reported in the journal Pain. What I'm going to talk about today is the mechanistic self-transcendent outcomes were just accepted in the Journal of Mindfulness this week. So that's our sample. We had 285 folks. I'm not going to go through that, but we randomized them to one of 3 15-minute preoperative conditions. So either a mindful breathing practice from Moore, which Eric introduced earlier, hypnotic suggestion, or a cognitive behaviorally based pain psychoeducation. And what we found was that patients randomized to both mindfulness and hypnosis reported significantly less pain intensity, pain unpleasantness, and anxiety immediately after that 15-minute intervention. But the mindful breathing practice seemed to do a little more. The folks that got mindful breathing also reported less pain medication desire. And remember, in surgical patients, this is a good outcome. But then we followed these folks after surgery. We found those patients that received the preoperative mindfulness training reported better physical functioning at their 6-week follow-up assessment. In fact, the patients that got that preoperative mindfulness training reported physical function levels at their 6-week follow-up assessment more similar to what you would expect at the 3-month follow-up assessment. So it looked like a little bit of mindfulness before surgery was able to accelerate these people's recovery pretty dramatically. We'll talk about replication here in a second. But the question is, how did such a brief intervention have such a long-term effect? We thought self-transcendence might be implicated. I was going to talk a little bit about the practice, but I think Eric already alluded to this. It's sort of a basic breathing, body, mind awareness to start with. And we kind of shift to a direct pointing practice that kind of encourages people to equate the field of awareness to the space of the sky. Can we observe thoughts and sensations as clouds passing through this vast, open, undisturbed space? And what we found was that 15 minutes of this style of mindful breathing had a large effect on people's self-transcendent states, right? Self-transcendence increased by about 70% after mindfulness. So it appeared that self-transcendence in some shape or form was accessible to a general sample of surgical patients meditating in a busy orthopedic center. But I also want to kind of contextualize these because mindfulness was definitely able to increase these patients' alterations of the sense of self. But if we expand that y-axis to look at the NADA's full range, there's still a whole lot of space in that upper registry, right? So kind of from halfway up the scale to the very top, we're not really seeing any movement in that space. And I think that space really intrigues me, but let's not get lost there. So We used then path modeling to see if these changes in the preoperative self-transcendent state after that 15 minutes of mindfulness predicted less pain and anxiety before surgery, as well as better function after surgery. And indeed, that's what we found. And I think that this data may reflect kind of the clinical benefits of expanding surgical patients' perception boxes. Earlier this week, Dr. Christoph Koch suggested that we are all prisoners, right, in this idiosyncratic perception box. And surgical pain would appear to me to be a pretty noxious and maybe close set imprisonment. But maybe as that moment of mindful transcendence widens the perceptual field into that more spaciousness of the sky, the architecture of these patients' perceptual box maybe is altered in some sort of appreciable way. And maybe that moment of mindfulness reveals that the patients, in fact, have the capacity to change, kind of the self-efficacy to change the structure of that box, maybe even lifting the top, right? Kind of opening that box to some degree. So these results are promising, but we're still a bit skeptical. So we did a follow-up study. Primary outcomes from this one reported in the Journal of Consulting and Clinical Psychology. And again, this was at the Orthopedic Center. We randomized 118 knee or hip replacement patients in this study to either one of 3 20-minute preoperative interventions, mindful breathing, mindfulness of pain, or cognitive behavioral pain psychoeducation. Just as a reminder, that mindfulness of pain practice is really designed to help patients deconstruct pain here. So helping them use mindful awareness to separate their thoughts about pain from their physical sensations of pain, their emotional reactions to pain from the physical sensations, to sort of just really pull it apart. What we found here in our preoperative clinical results was that the mindfulness of breath practice had the largest effect on acute preoperative pain. Interestingly, that mindfulness of pain practice wasn't statistically better or worse than the other 2 interventions on acute pain. But postoperatively, both preoperative mindfulness practice significantly decreased pain intensity, pain unpleasantness, and opioid use in the first month after surgery. In fact, at that 1 month point, almost none of the patients that got preoperative mindfulness training were still using opioids. And to my mind, that's a pretty solid return on investment, right? A little mindfulness before surgery. Here we're talking 20 minutes, translated into a month of less pain postoperatively and less postoperative opioid use. But again, the question is how. So our mechanistic results indicated that 20 minutes of mindfulness, again, had a large effect on self-transcendent states. Self-transcendent states increased by 70% or greater in this general sample of surgical patients. But unfortunately, our randomization failed this year. You can see the mindfulness of breath and the mindfulness of pain, the blue and the green lines they came into the session at different kind of states of self-transcendence. So it's hard to draw conclusions about kind of the differential potential of these 2 different styles of mindfulness practice on the induction of self-transcendent states. So clearly more research is needed to kind of improve our precision here. So then, just as in the first study, we connected self-transcendence preoperatively with our clinical outcomes and found that realizing that preoperative self-transcendent state predicted less pain before surgery, as well as less pain after surgery. Now, there's other therapeutic mechanisms here, but it looks like that moment of transcendence days, even weeks before surgery, seem to follow patients into the early recovery period. And as I said earlier in this conference and listened to Dr. Carhart-Harris, this model seemed to map really nicely on these 2 sets of results that we've seen. I think all we really need to do is replace the word stress in this original model, perhaps with the word pain. And then we have chronic pain kind of operating as this primer and acute preoperative pain as the trigger for what I'm going to call a pivotal mindful state here, more specifically kind of moment of mindful transcendence, which then functions as kind of this mediating state for rapid clinical change. And I think we can overlay this model from Eric and Barbara Fredrickson to maybe elucidate how that final arrow of Carhart-Harris's model, that psychological chain arrow, unfolds, right? So perhaps that brief moment of mindfulness is enough to perturb this self-schema of sickness, of injury. And that momentary perturbation may then ripple into kind of widening circles of healing as successive iterations of adaptive mindful reappraisals inform and propel each other. So this kind of upward spiral of sort of re-understanding the self, re-understanding injury, re-understanding the world. But clearly more explanatory work is needed here. But at this point, I'm just struck by how similar the results from these two ortho studies are, right? And I think the conclusions they suggest are pretty intriguing. Both studies suggest that a brief single session mindfulness training can decrease clinical symptomology by increasing self-transcendent states, which begs a few questions. Where else in our medical, surgical, whatever system pathways can we spare 15 to 20 minutes to maybe shake people up a little bit? And how else might these self-transcendent states be induced quickly and safely within these settings? And I want to conclude by proposing how I'm understanding these findings at this point, right? And I think that understanding is informed by my view of the treatment of chronic health conditions. Treating chronic health conditions is difficult because the malady, in our case pain, often gets tangled up in the sense of self. Now, this often happens over time. This entanglement happens slowly, often unconsciously for folks. This is perhaps the psychological analog to that structural canalization discussed by Dr. Carhart-Harris earlier this week. If I say, I am in pain enough times, then perhaps pain starts to be mistaken for the self, because that little preposition gets dropped out of that sentence, and at that point, pain starts to become a primary identity, right? Instead of I am in pain, I am pain. So maybe this is where our moment of mindful transcendence can be helpful. If in that healing state of consciousness, we can wipe pain from the brain, at least momentarily, then perhaps the sense of self can begin to be more adaptively reorganized. Or more succinctly, if pain is located in the self and the self is transcended, then there is no pain. Perhaps even briefer, no self, no problem. Maybe a bit simplistic, but maybe not. It's a lot of additional work here. We've been trying to connect physio data in this context, but in the clinical setting, it's tough just for time constraints. But we're moving along. And I just want to end by saying thank you to the folks at the C-Mind Lab for all their work here. Thank you for listening. Hope you enjoy the rest of your Friday.
Next, from Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, Akshaj Joshi.
Okay. Hello, everyone. First of all, it's a privilege to be here in the presence of so many stalwart researchers and philosophers. My name is Akshaj. I recently graduated college from a neighboring state, UC Berkeley, where I studied neuroscience and Mandarin Chinese. And I've been working since then at the Sadhguru Center for a Conscious Planet, which is an interdisciplinary research center at BIDMC in Boston. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic has led to 6 million deaths so far. And as important as it is to reduce the death toll and the disease burden on the patient population, we were interested in this study on the secondary effects of the pandemic on mental health. So some research and commentary has gone into what these secondary effects are. One is that the people have found an increased levels of psychological distress and anxiety. For example, one study in Australian adults found that during the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a reduction in physical activity, there was a reduction in the quality and duration of sleep, and there was an increase in the tobacco and alcohol use in Australian adults, which was correlated with an increase in depression, anxiety, and stress. Similarly, because of the pandemic, people have been sleeping worse. A part of it is that there are certain circadian markers that are related to your routines in terms of getting up and going to work, which have been disturbed because of working from home. Similarly, the people have been feeling more isolated because of quarantining and self-isolation. And also, there's been an increase in the use of substances as a coping mechanism for the increase in stress and anxiety that people are experiencing. Now, there are many ways that you could deal with stress and anxiety. Some are healthier than others. One way that people have been practicing this in the United States is the practice of yoga. Brief history of yoga, just so we understand what we're talking about, because traditional understandings may be different from what is actually being studied in modern research. In the interest of time, we just skip through this. Suffice it to say that there's some evidence that yoga may have been practiced in the Indus Valley civilization, although this is controversial because the script of the civilization hasn't been deciphered. There is evidence of the idea of ascetic practices and also the word yoga in the Vedas, which are about 3,200 years old. The idea here was that with regular ascetic practice, people can change their experience of life from being that of an individual to that of a universal consciousness. And religiously, this was envisioned as an individual consciousness that is Atman being subsumed into or joining the collective or universal consciousness, which is the Parabrahman. And about 2,000 years ago, the Yoga Sutras were written, which were a more methodological way of representing the practice and the philosophy of yoga. So although we may think of yoga and meditation as different because of the, in the West, traditionally, many practices that we would consider meditation would be often termed as yoga. Recently, yoga and meditation have been undergoing scientific scrutiny in the context of health and disease. Of course, those metaphysical claims from the earlier slides, the veracity of them has yet to be established, but we can study the effect of yoga and meditation on health in the context of health and disease. People have found that yoga seems to lead to a decreased level of anxiety and stress and higher levels of well-being, and also seems to improve sleep quality and reduce sleep duration, both subjectively and objectively under polysomnography. Yoga, so a recent study that was done by our group in collaboration with the University of Florida has found a meditation-specific immune response. Meditation specific because genes associated with circadian rhythm and genes associated with nutrition were taken into account in this analysis. And this paper found that, surprisingly, genes related to oxidative stress were downregulated in meditators. Genes related to immune function were upregulated, particularly genes related to interferon signaling, without an increase in genes related to inflammation being upregulated. So this provides some idea of the effects of yoga and meditation and also the mechanisms by which this may occur. But here we were interested in a particularly potent and acute stressor of the pandemic, longitudinally if yoga and meditation could have an effect. So the study design involved both an observatory arm and also a randomized controlled trial arm. In the observatory arm, we included seasoned yoga practitioners. These are people who've been practicing yoga for a long time and are experts. And in the randomized control trial arm, we included people who were either novice or not at all practitioners of yoga and meditation. So this was done through Snowball Sampling, which is we first recruited the seasoned meditators, and then we asked them to nominate into the study people that they know who are age, gender, and location matched, but were not yoga meditators or meditation practitioners. Then these people were randomized in one-to-one to either practice a 2-minute yoga practice, or they were given the choice of sitting still or reading a book for 15 minutes per day. Now, we did some surveys to see what their mental well-being was like at baseline and then in 6 weeks and 12 weeks. The actual meditation practice that the active control group was given was called Sima Kriya. So this is a meditation which is about a 2-minute breathing practice followed by an open awareness meditation. In the interest of time, we may go through this rather quickly. The main points here are that we included people based on their location in the United States and also their age. And then we also randomized the people according to the active control group, which learned the meditation, or the placebo control group, which read a book or sat alone. We did have some attrition throughout this longitudinal study, which is to be expected in longitudinal study and also was probably exacerbated by the pandemic itself. This may be of interest to you. As it happened, a lot of our participants came from California and Texas and not many from the Midwest. In all of the groups, it was about 57% women, and the median age was about in the low 40s. So our primary outcome was looking at perceived stress, which is assessed using the perceived stress scale. So here we found that the seasoned yoga practitioners had a lower perceived stress score at all time points, and so statistically significant. At baseline, the control and placebo, the active control and the placebo control were not different at baseline for perceived stress. There was a significant difference with the active control compared to the placebo control at 6 weeks, but not at 12 weeks, which is interesting. Then we looked at data with just compliant participants, where this was participants who actually did the practices we were telling them to do consistently. And here we actually found that the baseline was not different, but both 6 and 12 weeks were different between the active control and the placebo control, suggesting even if you're not seasoned, if you practice even a 2-minute meditation and yoga practice, it seems to lead to a reduction in perceived stress. In terms of well-being, the yoga practitioners who were seasoned had a relatively unchanged well-being throughout the study, and the other 2 groups managed to increase their well-being to become about the same as the seasoned practitioner group towards the end of the study. There was a difference in well-being at 6 weeks between the active control group and the placebo control group, but not at 12 weeks again. So some of the limitations of the study are, one, the large participant attrition. Some solutions we've thought of here are doing things like weekly check-ins to motivate participants to keep up with the study. And also you can do things like doing statistical analyses on the people who dropped out at the 3rd time point, but not the 2nd time point, to see if the reason that they dropped out was because they weren't experiencing an effect. And so you have a biased sample of people who stayed in the study who actually experienced an effect. So we've been doing that for recent studies. Also, due to the pandemic, it was difficult to get objective data, and we opted to get large numbers of subjective data, but it would have been interesting to use a device that looks at heart rate and also breathing rate, which are readily available, and we've been doing this in our recent studies with dry electrodes as well to get objective data. So some of the future directions that we're excited about are exploring why yoga meditation may be actually leading to these effects physiologically. One study is related to the immune system, which we've already talked about, but there's a lot of interesting studies to be done in the realm of sleep research. For example, showing data from a study here which shows that experienced meditators generally have lower levels of generally sleep less and have different REM microarchitecture. So sleep is divided into stages. REM sleep is generally when dreaming occurs, but it's not exclusively during REM sleep. And it's also very important for memory consolidation. So meditation has, experienced meditators have been shown to have more REM epochs in their sleep and also longer durations of REM sleep. Another thing of interest is to look at how meditation could be providing a physiological buffering to sleep deprivation. So the idea is that when you're well rested, there's strong reciprocal cortical inhibition. There's strong inhibition between the frontal parietal network and the default mode network, which allows you to stay on task when you need to stay on task and allows you to mind wander when you need to mind wander. But when you're sleep deprived, these inhibitions, the strength of the inhibitions is weakened so that you're switching between mind wandering and keeping your attention on a task. What's interesting is that the strength of these cortical inhibitions can be sampled using high frequency heart rate variability, because the same regions that are involved in this cortical inhibition also send inhibitory projections to cardiac acceleratory neurons. So your heart rate variability can tell you something about the strength of your cortical, particularly prefrontal inhibition. What is interesting is that meditations have been shown to increase high frequency heart rate variability, which is also a measure of parasympathetic drive, suggesting increased relaxation. And therefore, it could be possible that meditation could provide a physiological buffering to sleep deprivation through increasing the strength of cortical inhibition and through training the ability to pay attention even though you are sleep deprived. And that is it. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the study. So A question. So there was a huge sample, right? 1,000 people in the active arm and 1,000 in the control.
Yes. And it ended up being about 200 in each arm, 100, 200 after attrition.
After attrition.
Yep.
Did you get the genetics on all of those 200 people, or?
Oh, so the genetics was a different study. I think the sample size there was a couple of hundred people. And yeah, it was a large scale genomic analysis of a couple of hundred people done before meditation and then at a monthly basis afterwards.
And that was a randomized trial?
No, there was no randomization in that. It was just observational.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was very recently published in PNAS.
I just saw that.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. That concludes the session, and thank you, the online attendees as well.